All right, welcome back. Let's get right to our Rush Hour Roundtable. Today, I am joined by NewsNation's Leland Vittert, host of On Balance. We have Shibani Joshi. She is a business and technology journalist. Rick Green is an attorney and founder of PatriotAcademy.com. And we are joined again by Marc Lamont Hill, a media studies professor at Temple University. Thank you all Roundtable members for being here today. Our team on the Hill obviously earlier went through the latest on Clarence and Ginny Thomas and Hunter Biden, famous families, but the people at the center of these controversies are not the ones in power. So the question, and Leland, I will send it to you first, should our leaders face consequences for their messy family members?
It's a great question, but we really have to keep these two stories separate. There is no moral equivalency here. Hunter Biden is under investigation for committing federal crimes, among them tax evasion involving millions of dollars coming from major American adversaries. He might go to jail for that. That is very different than Ginny Thomas. Even the hackiest of Washington pundits don't believe that salacious Washington gossip, which is what these texts are, that have been leaked, even viewed in the most difficult light, come anywhere close to evidence of a crime. These are wildly different things. Ginny Thomas is certainly guilty of bad judgment and sending texts that she probably wished she hadn't. If that was a crime, we would all be in jail. Hunter Biden is under investigation for really serious federal crimes that may or may not have involved influence peddling regarding his father. You have to keep these separate, and to try and conflate the two and say, oh, well, if we can investigate Hunter Biden, then we must investigate Ginny Thomas, just doesn't fly.
All right, so Leland says there's no moral equivalency here. Marc, I saw you shaking your head as he was speaking. So do you think that potentially or attempting to overturn a presidential election is not morally equivalent to potential tax evasion?
I think all of this is beside the point. The question isn't whether or not there's a moral equivalent between what happened with Ginny Thomas, what happened with Hunter Biden. The question is, should we be holding Joe Biden accountable in a different way than we would hold Clarence Thomas? And for me, the answer is, the short answer is no, right? You can't be accountable for what your relatives do. I don't care who it is, Democrat, Republican, you can't be accountable for what they do. However, to the opposite of what Leland would say, you'll be surprised to know I'm going to take the opposite position on this. I would argue that there's much more accountability, potentially, in who you choose to marry and who you choose to spend time with than who your children are. You can't control who your child is. You control who your partner is. If I have a partner that is engaging in an attempt to overthrow the government or to overturn an election, or let's go to another extreme, to rob a bank, right? You could make some questions about my own choices and judgment, but still, I would not support censuring or what's the word? Or removing from his position Clarence Thomas, right? Mm-hmm. In any sort of impeachment. That's the word I was trying to think of. I wouldn't support that unless there's evidence that he was somehow complicit, unless there was evidence that for some reason he should have recused himself from a particular case, or that he made some judgment that was in response to what she was doing. So in general, I say no, nobody should be held accountable for what their family members do. And I think it's particularly important, finally, for women, because oftentimes women would be the people who would be punished by this. Women politicians, women advocates would be the ones who would be punished for what their husbands did. Imagine if Hillary Clinton were held accountable for what Bill Clinton did, just as one example.
Well, so Rick, do you agree? I mean, should family members be held accountable? He is saying that, for example, Clarence Thomas should not recuse himself, but we have to look at the ethics in all of this. Some people would say there is such an ethical violation here, potentially.
Well, with all due lack of respect for Marc's comment, trying to say that somehow Ginny was involved in trying to overthrow the government. I mean, that's so absurd to even throw that out there, guys. Come on. I
didn't say that. I didn't say that. I even gave the extreme of robbing a bank. I hope you don't think I was accusing her of robbing a bank either.
Well,
I was
your
giving
third
the
one was, yeah, after two that were still trying to act like anyone was trying to overthrow the government or reverse an election.
That's not what I'm saying.
The whole question was, how does the 12th Amendment work? The whole thing was about how do you deal with disputed electors? That should be allowed to be discussed. As Patrick Henry said, according to the magnitude of the subject, ought to be the freedom of the debate. So I think Leland was 100% right. These two things are so different. The real question, though, that we should all be asking is, did the loved one, the family member, benefit from or aid or encourage illegal activity? Zero of that in Ginny's case. There's still a question of whether or not Joe Biden benefited or encouraged. If he's the big guy and got 10% on some of these transactions, then absolutely we should be asking those questions, and the family member should be held accountable as well.
Well, we also do want to add, though, of course, the Biden situation has been going on a lot longer than the Jenny Thomas situation. Let's go through a little bit of a timeline here. I believe we can pull that up. I mean, this goes all the way back from 2014 to 2019. You know, Hunter Biden served, of course, as Burisma Group board member. Then in April 19, his laptop was dropped off at a Delaware computer repair shop. In July of that same year, President Trump asked Ukrainian President Zelensky to probe Hunter Biden. Then fast forward to October of 2020, the New York Post releasing a story on leaked contents of that laptop. And of course, that leads us to this month with the Washington Post confirming the validity of Hunter Biden's emails. So Shibani, we've let the men speak out on this. I saw you kind of making somewhat of an expression there. I don't want to read, I don't want to assume what you were thinking. Tell us, what do you think? Should family members be held accountable?
I agree with many of the points that have been brought up today. You have this, it's a complex issue, the issue of legality, of the issue of direct connection, whether a spouse is more of a close connection than a child. Obviously, that it remains to be determined. And then you also have the issue of how do you control for this? This is something that, you know, within the corporate sector and business, this is something that comes up obviously on a different scale of you know, CEOs and executives are not supposed to engage in activities or their relatives that can lead to direct profits. But does that necessarily put the guardrails on a family member being able to give a speech, for example? Is that violating the rules because their parent might be the CEO of a company? I mean, it gets into such gray territory here. I think what these issues bring up and is just the need for good common sense also. I mean, I'm not sure whether Ginny was using the most common sense in terms of being involved in some of the things that she's allegedly being involved in. And again, the accountability, I'm just not sure how we do this in the political sphere.
And so, Leland, I'll throw it over to you. I mean, you know, Shibani mentioned there, you know, comes down to common sense at some points. But where do we draw that line? How do we determine that?
Well, in the end, it's up to the courts to draw it when it comes to whether something is legal or illegal. Whether it's common sense is by definition not legal or illegal. And that's really what this comes down to. And sort of
right.
what we as journalists at least have to deal with is that there are separate issues between people exercising bad judgment and saying things that are pretty loony, as Ginny Thomas did, versus committing acts which are illegal, which in the case of Hunter Biden at least, there is reason to believe that it implicates his father. Now, those ties haven't been proven yet, but there are certainly threads to pull on. And you think about this investigation that's going on of a sitting president's son by his father's DOJ in a state that he used to be the senior senator involving a country in which the president is now intimately involved in giving hundreds of millions of dollars in aid to during a war. That is an extraordinarily complicated and conflicted situation. If there's not conflicts there, it doesn't exist. The wife of a Supreme Court justice who happens to be a political operative texting pretty outlandish things to the chief of staff are very, very different situations. And it's dangerous when you start conflating the two and saying, because somebody, you know, bumped into you at a bar, it's the same as somebody whacking somebody over the head with a glass bottle at a bar simply because it happened at a bar.
All right, so Marc, you know, I'm looking at the camera here, but I am able to read body language pretty well. I can see you certainly have something to say to react to Leland. Go ahead.
Well, there's so much. I'm actually just quite confused. I mean, this feels like a straw man. The argument here isn't that Joe Biden's situation and Clarence Thomas's situation is the same. If I understood the question, it was,
you are correct.
Should people who are held accountable for their family, should people be held accountable for their family's mistakes? Mm-hmm. And I hear, well, you know, there's if there's reason to believe that Joe Biden was implicated in this. Well, no, there's reason to suspect, but there's not reason to believe it. We have to investigate. If we find something, sure. But that's not a question about family. Anybody who's accused of a crime anybody who's found or proven to have committed a crime should be held accountable, whether they're related or not. But the question is, let's assume Clarence Thomas is innocent, and let's assume Joe Biden is innocent.
Mark, I just got to stop you.
Mark,
hold on. Mark, words matter. Mark, words matter.
Let Mark finish, because we listen to you. Let's let Mark
finish the
finish.
thought, and then I'm happy to answer your question, but let me finish the thought. What I'm saying is that the question for me is, assuming that each person is not involved, should they be held accountable simply because they are directly related to someone? And I'm saying no. I am not making any judgments about whether Joe Biden committed a crime or not. What I'm saying is, if he did, he should be held accountable. If he didn't, he should not be held accountable simply because his son did. That's all I'm saying.
No, there's no question about that, but you made you said a word that's pretty important. If Clarence Thomas is innocent, innocence is about a crime, about guilt. And so far, we have to be very clear that no one has even gone within 100 miles of accusing Ginny Thomas of a crime.
I agree.
Hunter Biden is under investigation for a federal crime, for multiple federal crimes. These are very, very different things. And
so very different things, Leland, but should President Biden be held accountable?
I'm not claiming, that's why this is a straw man. I'm not claiming that Ginny Thomas has committed a crime. I'm saying let's assume that no one has done anything wrong. Let's not use the word innocent. Let's not use the language of legality, because innocence isn't just a legal term. It's also a moral term. Okay, so I was using it in the moral level, not the legal level. But to make sure that there's no confusion here, I'm saying let's assume that no one's done anything wrong who's in the position of power, but maybe let's assume that everyone's family did something wrong. I'm saying we shouldn't hold people accountable for what their family did. That's all I'm saying. And I don't actually think you're disagreeing with me. That's the irony of this. I don't think anybody on this planet was disagreeing with me.
Leland, would you like to?
No, it's not really it's not anybody's place as a journalist to agree or disagree with the premise. You're not, sins of the father go back to the Bible in terms of who is held morally responsible, if you will. I think probably, Nicole, and as I think about what you're asking, it may be more of a media analysis question, right? Is that should the media, in a sense, bring up bad acts of a private individual that would otherwise be completely irrelevant in the national conversation, but for that person being the son, daughter, wife, husband of a very influential person. And the reason it becomes
that's
news,
a different question.
Right.
And the reason it becomes news and becomes as a story in any of these cases is, does this private individual enjoy certain benefits,
right,
or have certain
but a private individual who has a lot of access that the average person doesn't have.
Yeah, and Nicole, if I may, I mean, I think that's what Leland's getting at here is how do we define accountability? I think Marc's right. Is there accountability? And then what is the accountability? It's not always just legal.
Rick, did I just hear you agree with Marc?
There's reputation accountability here. There's a political accountability. If he's over there, if Hunter Biden is over there benefiting from his father's position and his father is not putting a stop to it, then there is a political and a media accountability to be held here. And I also appreciate Leland's metaphor being at the bar, because after this, we're all going to need to go to the bar. But I do think we're getting to the bottom of it here, and that is, should there be accountability for someone's actions if you could have done something about it and it was your position of elected influence that was allowing them to abuse the system?
All right. Well, very good debate, my friends. We will continue this conversation. We're going to take a break, and then we'll be right back. Thank you for watching. Click the red subscribe button below so you can get more of NewsNation's fact-driven, unbiased coverage.